So thank you everyone for coming. It's a real privilege for me to be here. I feel a great deal of gratitude and humility that people in Nepal are so willing to trust me with their stories and share with me aspects of their lives. So today what I'm going to do is to talk to you about climate change in Nepal and adaptation challenges. I'm going to first talk a little bit about some of the biophysical changes that are expected and also already being witnessed in Nepal. And then I'm going to speak a little bit about some of the social and political challenges. So you can go to the next slide. So some of you may know about some of the climate impacts in Nepal, but for those of you who don't, both the stories that I collect and the data that comes out of climate models suggest that there's increasing extreme events, particularly rainfall and drought. I think we've all witnessed some of the flooding that's gone on in recent years. There's an overall increase in temperatures, and in particular warming of winter temperatures, which has a really big impact on glaciers and snowfall. We see a change in the pattern of the monsoon. So the rains are coming later, or raining at the wrong time, like raining right at harvest time. And this is causing a number of challenges for farmers, which has been pretty well documented in the last 5 years. And of course, melting of glaciers is one of the major concerns, leading to both a decrease in the overall glaciers, but also changes in when the glaciers release their water. The loss of winter snowfall is really major. So this is a picture from Chumali in northern Gorkha, and from December, and normally at this time of year, there should be snow up on the peaks behind in this picture. And that snowpack is really important in terms of providing moisture, rain, irrigation water in the spring when they're getting ready to plant, as all that water starts to melt. So, in fact, very close to this picture, just on this side of it, there was a kulo that was damaged during the earthquake, and people hadn't bothered to repair it because they said, well, there's no water for it anyway. So the lands that were normally planted in the spring, they were either planting them later or just leaving them fallow because they didn't have the water to irrigate them. And then finally, the effects of pollution on rain and snowfall are quite significant, and Anjana mentioned that in her opening remarks. I have a colleague who is a physicist that works on basically ice formation in clouds, and pollution and dust causes more cloud formation. So a lot of the kind of clouds that we see in the wintertime, or the kind of hazy skies that we get now from the lower valleys, is due to pollution not only in Nepal itself, but also coming from northern India and dust. But even though the clouds are there, the dust particles and pollution particles in the clouds prevent the formation of rain. And so that's one of the reasons why we're seeing a decrease in winter rain and snowfall. And this has really major implications for people's ability to get planted, start planting early in the season. Okay. Next slide. So one of the concerns for me as a scholar of Nepal and on climate change is the way in which the Himalayas are talked about in the global narrative. So there's no question that the Himalayas are really important in the climate system globally. So changes here can influence climate all across the world. The Himalayas feed 12 rivers that are used by 2 billion people in 16 countries. But the consequence of this is that what goes on in Nepal, what happens in local forests and local ecosystems, becomes a matter of global concern. So when people come in and they try to implement projects, their concern is much less about the welfare of local people and much more about this wider global narrative about how the Himalayas fit in the climate system. So that's something that I feel like Nepali scholars and policy activists really need to keep a close eye on. So it's not only that we need to be concerned about local people, of course we're also concerned about the global climate, but that balance between what is necessary for the local ecosystem and what's necessary for the global ecosystem doesn't always line up well. So next slide, please. So the kind of adaptation challenges that this presents for local people on the ground are multiple. Farmers need to adjust the timing of their planting, the kinds of crops that they use. There's a number of adaptation projects that have tried to promote, like, for example, planting apples at higher elevation and suntala at higher elevation, or tea, to try, and some of these are, they're kind of risky, because they're basically saying, okay, these global climate models know what will happen, so let's plant these crops that take quite a long time to mature, so they're not going to give any immediate benefits to local people, and let's see if they work. My sense is that they probably will in most places, but it is part of that adaptation challenge, is how do we prepare today for something that we think we know will happen in the future, but actually we don't know for sure. It could change. Warming temperatures are quite significantly changing growing conditions. When I've tried to talk to farmers about this, it's difficult to get any direct correlation. So they will talk about this problem with like winds or change in the rain. I've asked them, what they do if they try to modify the crops. And a lot of times, especially with vegetables, if they have a crop that doesn't work, they just stop growing it. They're like, no, then we shifted to something else. We tried tomatoes, didn't work, forget it, too much work. So, but the other kind of major thing going on is exposure to hazards. So the Himalayas have always been landslide prone. This is nothing new, but there's more now, and especially after the earthquake, a lot of hillsides seem to be more unstable. They're getting a bit more frequency, can wipe out people's lands. The glacial lake outburst floods are a big concern. So as glaciers melt, water accumulates underneath, and you get an ice dam, which can then suddenly burst and lead to major flooding downstream. They've had a couple of quite catastrophic events in the Indian Himalayas, and particularly around hydropower installations, which sort of make it worse because all the water accumulates on the hydro dam, and then that goes, and now you've got a really big flood that started as a serious flood and now is a very serious flood. And of course flooding, which we've all seen the effects of this in the last few years. But one of the points I want to make today is that climate change affects not only landscapes and livelihoods, it affects bodies and psyches. People have to work in different ways. They maybe work harder. They maybe move in different ways. The sense of kind of loss or uncertainty or fear is quite profound. And I have seen it a bit more directly with the after effects of the earthquake, where some of the people that I know, they still find it really challenging to walk on trails that they've walked their whole lives, that had major landslides during the earthquake and were quite dangerous to cross afterwards. And even though they're more stable now, they still have more fear around the landslides than they used to. So this kind of embedding in the psyche of loss, of fear, of uncertainty is not something that I think we should dismiss. Next slide. So in addition to these kind of adaptation challenges we might have at the biophysical level, there's also a number of social and political adaptation challenges. For me, a lot of my work is oriented around justice, and so I ask questions about justice and governance. And these questions for me are quite simple, but I think are crucial to ask. And so they are, who's authorized to govern change? Who's considered to have the right knowledge and expertise to understand how we should prepare for an uncertain future? Who makes decisions? And who's required to make changes? And these people are almost never the same. So the people making decisions, the people who are considered to have the expertise, are usually telling somebody else what they ought to be doing to change. And I think that for us in the Himalayas, where we have growing inequalities in education, opportunities, and wealth, these kinds of questions are absolutely vital to ask. Who is the adapting subject? It's not usually people living in comfortable houses in Kathmandu, but I think the reality of it is that all of us are going to have to adapt, and all of us need to make changes. This is a photo from Humla in 2011 with a flood from a glacial lake outburst flood. And what was interesting about this was that the local adaptation plans of action had just been created. They had done a vulnerability assessment, and Humla was considered at very low risk of glacial lake outburst floods. So even though it's considered highly vulnerable, this was not a risk that was identified. And afterwards, people were really angry. They were like, you told us this wasn't a problem for us. Like, how come you didn't prepare us for this? So even though these kind of floods or, kind of catastrophic events might not be unusual in their lives, they felt a bit cheated that they hadn't been warned properly. So there's sort of this whole really complicated things about how we imagine what the future will be, who we tell what to, and then how people interpret that and how they then prepare themselves. Next slide. Okay, so I just want to give you a little snapshot of some of the efforts that are going on in the hills in Nepal around adaptation. So these slides are from the East, and a project supported by, I'll not name names here, but international conservation organizations, and in collaboration with the Nepal government and forestry projects, implemented an adaptation program in quite a remote district of the Far East. So I went to go visit. I saw what they were doing, and they had put in, so they grow cardamom as a cash crop. That's been a long-term process for them. But the winter drying was affecting their harvest, so they put in an irrigation system in their leche plantations. And people were pretty happy with this. They felt like that had helped. The community forestry user group, so we're sitting here having a little performative focus group. I don't know how many of you work in development, but people are really good at these kind of groups now in the hills. They weren't when I first started working here a long time ago. But the community forestry user group is planted lopta within the community forest, and they're using it to start a paper factory, hoping to kind of sell that abroad. So a variety of initiatives going on, mostly kind of community-based. And in this particular place, I think people felt that it had kind of addressed various of their needs. They had some hopes that it was going to transform things for them. A number of the young men there, by young I mean, somewhere between say 25 and 35, told me that they considered themselves the lost generation because their education had been disrupted during the conflict. Many of them had gone to Malaysia or the Gulf to get away from the conflict, and they're like, there's nothing we can do but be farmers now. And they were very keen to kind of innovate, very keen to take up any new technologies or opportunities for them to sort of make their farming more profitable for them. Next slide. Not all adaptation projects have been so successful, however. I have heard, I interviewed a number of facilitators of these local adaptation plans, and they told me that in general, people felt really happy with the program. They come with more resources generally than a lot of projects do, so they have money to actually implement stuff. It's a very consultative process, so people make their own decisions about what they should do. So people felt like it was responding to their needs for the most part. However, there was a number of disconnections when I went out and had a look at some of these projects. One was, as the facilitators said to me, nobody really knows what adaptation is. We don't quite know what to do. So a lot of the efforts are very much kind of standard development practice. Let's make an apple farm, let's see if we can build a new irrigation system or something like that. This is taken from the western Nepal, northwestern Nepal, in the Karnali, and there they had put together a greenhouse to grow yew trees, yew saplings. So for those of you who don't know, Taxus wallachania, which is the species in the Himalayas, has a number of medicinal properties in the bark. It's typically been a highly valued species for local people because it's very, very hard. So like the tip of the plow that they would use to plow the fields would be made of yew, and the rest of the plow would be made of other kinds of wood. It's very slow growing, and it grows in the understory, so it needs shade in order to reproduce. So presumably that was the point of the green plastic. Seems to have worked. There were a lot of vibrant little plants in there, but people had no idea what they were going to do with it. They're like, okay, yeah. I said, so what are you going to do with it? I don't know. So, you know, and so like the project came in and implemented this thing, and then there was kind of no follow-up. Next slide. And I think, to be fair to some of the people at the local level that are trying to govern these things and implement these things, not only is my point about how people aren't really sure what adaptation is, and I would say that's globally, that's not a problem within Nepal or a problem of these facilitators, but also there's been these major disconnects between the kind of money coming from the global level, the efforts at promoting adaptation through national and local adaptation plans, and then the kind of governance structure at the local level. So in 2013, before the new system came into effect, I interviewed somebody in the Far East, a local development officer, who said, and I think he spoke for most of the people I've talked to at that level, we have so many demands here: roads, drinking water, electricity. Climate change is a cross-cutting issue, but there's no Ministry of Environment office here. The name has changed now. How can local infrastructure, so he meant like offices at the local level, and national level structure come together? And unfortunately, I think that the new three government state system has not really helped this very much. So some of the Pradeshas have engaged in planning activities, some of them have a climate change officer, but at Gaon Palika and Nagrik Palika level, there simply is not that kind of structure. And I really hesitate to say capacity. That's what they tell us. They're like, we don't have the expertise, we don't know how to do this. And I'm like, okay, yes, maybe, but actually, I don't know that you need a climate change expert here to come in from Kathmandu. What you need are resources, you need training, maybe, you need to have some guidance from other levels, to help you make your own decisions. I don't know that they necessarily need a climate scientist in each Gaon Palika in Nepal. But unfortunately, the way the system is set up, that's how it feels. And then the Gaon Palika Adakshés that I've interviewed very much point out this temporal problem. My immediate problem is that there is, the road has washed out in the monsoon. I need to get that road fixed. Yes, it would be really nice to address climate change, but I need a drinking water system up in that ward. And so those immediate needs tend to kind of take the priority, and they make more sense to people. There are things they're used to doing, they seem obvious and relevant. So making kind of long-term plans is something that has been very challenging at the grassroots. Next slide. So another example here from the field. I like to break up my slides with words and my slides with pictures. But there's, so this is also from Western Nepal, and this adaptation program had implemented a cider press in a village that had really nice apple orchards. They're pretty far from the road. It's a couple of days walk to get any kind of products out of there. But for the most part, people in that region are pretty used to that. There's donkeys and things. The transport was not their biggest issue. And the point of the cider press was to add value as well as long-term storage to the apple product. Because if any of you have ever had an apple tree in your yard, you know that they all get ripe at the same time. And trying to actually do anything with all of them when they're ready is quite challenging. So, there was all set up, this is what the village looked like. There was one problem. There was no electricity supply. So the cider press had been built, and it was sitting there, and people thought this might be a nice idea, but there was no electricity to run it. But interestingly enough for me, the young men I talked to in the village, their big complaint was not so much about the electricity. I got the feeling that they could probably figure that out if they needed to. It was that they said, why did they just come and give us a press and not give us the training to fix it? This is not really worth anything to us if we don't have the skills. Why aren't they giving us more skills that we could then use for other things and be able to take care of this in the long term for ourselves? And I feel like that is a message that I'm hearing in a lot of parts of Nepal, and that I would really like people to listen to, which is that local people, they need support with infrastructure developments. But more than anything else, they want skills. They don't want to have to bring somebody in from the outside every time their hydropower system breaks. They want to be able to fix it there themselves. And actually, the Nagari Palika close to this village itself is in the Nagari Palika, but one of the more distant wards, had a hydro system that broke, and it took over 2 years to fix it because they had to bring engineers from China. So not the expertise and the parts were not available in Nepal. And they're like, what's the point of this? Like, we're back to where we had been for years. Next slide. So I'm just going to start to wrap up now, and I want to zoom out a little bit and just think about some of the implications of what these projects mean, what these issues around, who's making decisions, who's expected to change, and what they mean for us. So a lot of my work has focused on citizenship and belonging, political subjectivity, and I've noticed that especially resource governance, because this is vital to everyday livelihoods, is a really crucial domain wherein struggles for authority play out. I literally, in one place I worked, 2 elderly men got in a fist fight over who was going to be the autakshe of a new little takati growing program at the school. It was kind of sad, actually. I think they were a bit drunk at the time, but it mattered so much. We can sort of maybe say whatever we will about their behavior, but the fact that they were willing to fight over it told me how much was at stake, and I'm sure it wasn't just the spinach. It was really about that authority, that just ability to make those decisions. And at the same time, I think that recognition of citizenship rights is crucial to a sense of belonging to the nation. So when a local adaptation project comes in to a rural area like the part I've worked in north in the Karnali since 1993, and these districts have been really neglected. They've had very little development inputs or very little INGO investment until fairly recently. And when a project comes in, they feel like they're being seen. They're like, oh, finally somebody sees us, they see our needs. So these kind of recognitions are crucial. And yet when then they don't work, when the electricity isn't hooked up, when they're not trained to maintain the equipment themselves, they again sort of feel like they're pushed to the margins, or that their own skills and knowledge is not really valued. And so struggles over resources are often struggles over belonging. Not only are they struggles over authority, but they're also about, so who is important in the nation? And I just want to tell you a little story that was actually connected to a different project. But I was in the Mid-East, and we had just interviewed a headmaster at a school who was not from that region originally. And he told us that there was nobody there, that all the young people were gone. And I walked outside, and I kind of was walking between the school and this little mandir at the top of the hill. And I passed about 50 young people, men and women, between the ages of maybe 18 and 30. And I thought, wow, so he thinks they're nobody. Like that, so how come they're nobody? Maybe a lot of people are gone. I'm sure there are a lot of people who have out-migrated, but there are people, young people, living in villages, farming, engaging in practices there, committed to the land, committed to the community. And when we create that, when we cast them as nobody, when we cast them as unimportant, we just fuel more out-migration. And we fail to recognize the crucial role that they're playing in anchoring communities in Nepal. And then just finally, one more point here about, I don't want to get too political here, even though the truth is I've been studying Rajniti Parivartan since 2006. This is a finding actually not just from Nepal, but I'm part of a global effort to bring together case studies on adaptation from different parts of the world. And I don't understand why climate adaptation is not a bigger political priority. There's a lot of money coming in from the global level, especially the new loss and damage kind of fund. Adaptation is really meaningful in people's lives. When projects are done well, they feel a real sense of like, wow, finally the state did something for me. And so it's been curious to me why there aren't more politicians that are taking up climate adaptation and championing it, making it a crucial part of their platform, helping to legitimize themselves as leaders by actually accomplishing something in the climate adaptation domain, which frankly I think would be relatively easy. It's not that hard to put in an irrigation system. It doesn't cost that much money compared to other things that they spend on trying to create a sense of legitimacy and authority. But as I said, this is not just a finding from Nepal. It's a finding from Ecuador, it's a finding from Senegal, it's a finding from India, it's a finding from Fiji, that for some reason, adaptation is just this thing that they kind of let sit there, and people are not really taking it up as an important way that they can build political legitimacy and establish a kind of more of a sense of cohesion in the nation. Next slide. So another point I just want to bring out here is this question of vulnerability to what? So if you look at the global literature, you will get a lot of research on biophysical change and how this impacts people's everyday lives. I'm not saying that's not true. It is true. We have seen that, and I talked about it at the beginning. But there are other vulnerabilities as well. And they have to do with this social political domain around that, you get said that you're vulnerable and you need to change your livelihood. This happened in Laprak. They said, oh, your village is really vulnerable to landslides after the earthquake, we're gonna move you. Well, I've worked a little bit in Laprak. People don't spend time in the new village. They don't like it. It's not actually a nice place to be. And so what they do is when it's raining really heavy and they think, ooh, there might be a risk of landslide, they all go up there. And the rest of the year they stay in the old village. But it's quite significant that the state would come and say, you're vulnerable, you need to change your life. We know how to do that for you, here you go. Maybe it could have been done better, but nevertheless, the point is, when you're made vulnerable, you're not understood to actually have capacities and knowledge and abilities to make changes for yourself or decisions for yourself about what's best. But also, there's another kind of real big gap in some of the risk assessments that my colleague Hemant Ojha has pointed out. And as he said in a recent paper, there was no analysis of risk pertaining to the adoption of the policy itself. Community perceptions of risk and the pathways to decision-making were not considered. So the way in which policies are constructed and how they are played out, the risks that they won't work, the risks that they will backfire are not actually counted as one of the risks of climate adaptation, but our research shows that that's actually crucial. Next slide. I hope it's next to last slide, sorry. So there's no photo here. So what I want to invite you to do for a moment is look around at the walls, because I was going to use an image from the exhibit here to illustrate this slide. But one thing we see, again, globally, not just in Nepal, is this cementing of technical approaches. Let's build better irrigation, let's build warning systems. If we just put in place the right kind of climate experts in the right institutions or ministries, we'll figure it out. And that leads to a disconnection between anticipating the future and people's immediate needs. And adaptation is very much caught in between those. And I'd like to suggest here that I think art and culture can help to bridge these gaps. If we start to think about the ways that people make meaning of their everyday lives, what are the kind of practices through which they believe they will be safe, and in which they can cope with climate change. Some of the places I've worked, for example, they have asked a Rinpoche to come and do pujas to help with these strong winds that are destroying the crops. And I think we need to respect those practices. Maybe we need some other kind of technical solutions as well that we can work with them. But if we reject the notion that the puja is irrelevant, we completely disconnect from that immediate need, that sense of place, that sense of belonging, that sense of connection to nature that goes back in our tradition, or your tradition here, I should say, and that our ability to think and anticipate future change. Okay, so final slide, I hope. Yeah. Ooh, I think there's actually two more. I'm sorry. Am I going over, Siddhartha?
No,
okay.
fine.
Okay. So again, I just want to kind of conclude here at a slightly more abstract level. So vulnerability and disaster risk reduction are never innocent interventions into making people less vulnerable or less marginal, okay? And I just want to make that point really clear. They're never innocent. Doesn't matter how well they're done. They realign people's relationships with each other, to their resources, and to the state. And we need to treat with a great deal of respect and humility what the consequences of those realignments might be. And I think when we fail to recognize those realignments, we're much more likely to make mistakes that we don't want to be making, or reproducing hierarchies and vulnerabilities and marginality that we're trying to undo. And also really crucially is that new relationships entangle with existing ones with uncertain effects. And for me, I think that has probably been the biggest failure of adaptation programs, is a failure to recognize that what exists on the ground, the grazing committees, irrigation committees, community forestry committees, village farmer committees, that they already have their own institutional processes, their own dynamics of marginalization, authority, power, whatever. And if an adaptation project comes in and just fails to recognize that all that exists and says, okay, we're going to make a new committee for you to adapt, and here's what you're going to do, it just makes everything more complicated, and you get elderly men in fistfights. So I think somehow we need to be paying more attention to those dynamics. Okay, last slide. So I want to leave you with this question of adaptation to what? Okay. People have to adapt to social and political change, not only to weather. And here I want to keep this fairly confined to climate change itself, because we're also adapting to this global regime. The loss and damage fund debate was fascinating. I live in Norway. Norway's been very much a donor to global adaptation funds. And the lead negotiator of the COP was super frustrated about the loss and damage discussion, because she was saying, it's not enough. Okay, yeah, it's really nice to have this, but actually it allows people to dodge responsibility in other ways. So we have a changing political context. It's affecting Nepal. It was really serious during the kind of, constitutional vacuum between 2006 and 2017, where lots of money was coming in and nobody knew how to deal with it. The institutions weren't there, the ministries weren't functioning very well, the local governments weren't functioning. It was like, okay, so we have all this money, so how are we going to use it? And so it's those kind of politics I'm talking about that I think people have to adapt to. And again, I want to go back to this point that climate change transforms bodies and psyches, not just landscapes. And so I think that this need for art, culture, and local knowledge to inform practice, policy, and the global conversation on climate change is absolutely crucial. So thank you so much for listening.